The first thing you hear is the klaxon, not a drill, not a test. A real scramble tearing through the pre-dawn fog at RAF Debden, Essex, winter of 1944. The sound cuts through everything. Sleep, cold, the metallic taste of fear. You're on your feet before your brain catches up, boots pounding frozen dirt, breath a white plume in the dark. Somewhere over the channel, Luftwaffe fighters are inbound, Messerschmitts. And you have minutes, maybe less, to get 8 P-51 Mustangs off the ground and climbing. But here's the thing that separates this morning from every other scramble. A wrench. A modified dog-bone open-end wrench sitting in the hands of a crew chief whose name most records never caught and whose improvisation is about to cut the response time from wheels chocked to wheels rolling by 3/4. 20 minutes down to 5. 4 times quicker. If you're watching this because you love the hidden engineering stories that won wars, the human ingenuity under pressure, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to hear is how one mechanic's field hack changed the Intercept game in the European theater, and why the Luftwaffe never saw it coming. The Mustang sits in its revetment like a coiled spring. P-51D, serial painted on the fuselage in black stencil. Packard Merlin engine still radiating faint warmth from the last sortie 6 hours ago. Around it, the dispersal area smells like avgas, cut with wet earth and burnt cordite from yesterday's strafing runs. The ground crew is already moving. 3 men per aircraft, tools clanging, voices clipped. In a standard scramble, you follow a sequence drilled into muscle memory. External power cart connected, battery on, fuel mixture rich, propeller full forward, magnetos both, primer pump cycles, booster coil engaged, starter cartridge loaded if you're using pyrotechnic start, or energizer cart coupled for electric, then cowl panels cracked open for last-minute checks, oxygen lines verified, canopy cleared, wheel chocks yanked, marshaller waving you out. On a good day with warm oil and a hot engine, you might do it in 12 to 15 minutes per ship. On a cold morning like this, with oil thickened to syrup and moisture frosting every metal surface, you're looking at 20, maybe 25. And that's assuming nothing breaks, no hydraulic leaks, no bulky ignition coils, no fouled plugs. The Luftwaffe doesn't wait for you to sort out a cold start. They know the same radar stations and observer corps warning times you do. If they're over the coast and you're still at dispersal, the math doesn't work. You'll climb out and find nothing, or worse, you'll find them above you, slashing down with the sun at their backs. Bf-109 Gustavs, or the late-model Kurtz with their boosted Daimler-Benz engines and cannon armament that can shred a Mustang from 500 yards. Messerschmitts are not forgiving opponents. They're fast, they're maneuverable below 20,000 feet, and in the hands of a veteran Jagdflieger they can turn inside your radius if you're not careful. The standing joke among the pilots is that the Germans have 2 advantages. They start closer to home and they don't have to wait for you to finish your checklist. Except this morning, that joke stops being funny. The crew chief we're talking about, call him Eddie because that's what the squadron called him, Eddie or just Chief. Eddie had been watching the scrambles for weeks. Late 1943, early 44, when the 8th Air Force was pushing deeper into Germany and the Luftwaffe was still contesting every raid, the tempo was brutal. Scrambles 3-4 times a day, some real, some false alarms. But every one of them the same grinding routine. Hook up the cart, prime the engine, check the mags, starter engaged, wait for the Merlin to cough and catch, warm it up enough that you're not going to blow a jug on takeoff, disconnect everything, shove the panels back on, wave the pilot in, pull chocks, taxi, go. 20 minutes minimum, and that's with no hiccups. Eddie was good at his job. Everyone on the line was good, or they didn't last. But good wasn't enough. He'd seen what happened when you were late. He'd watched Mustangs return with holes in them because they'd climbed into a fight already in progress, or he'd watched them land with nothing to show because the bogies had turned back before contact. The intercept window is narrow. Radar gives you a bearing and approximate range, but the enemy is moving, you're moving, and every minute you spend on the ground is a minute they're using to close distance, gain altitude, or change course. If you can shave 10 minutes off your response time, you change the geometry. You meet them farther out. You have altitude. You have options. Eddie understood that. What he also understood was that the checklist wasn't the problem. The tools were. Standard procedure required multiple wrenches, multiple access points, multiple hands. You needed one guy on the fuel primer, another on the magneto switches, a third handling the starter cart, and monitoring for fire. And every single fastener, Every panel, every connection was its own discrete task. Eddie started sketching it out one night in the crew hut after a particularly frustrating scramble where they'd lost almost 30 minutes to a stuck cowl fastener and a reluctant primer. He laid out the sequence on paper, marking every point where hands touched metal, every tool swap, every second wasted reaching for a different wrench or walking around the wing. Then he went to work in the back of the hangar, past the spare tail sections and the racks of drop tanks, where the machinists kept the grinders and the forge. He took a standard open-end wrench, probably a 3/4 inch on one end, 1/2 inch on the other, and he modified it. Ground down the shoulders, drilled a new hole for a lanyard, bent the shank just slightly to give it clearance around tight cowl fasteners without fouling on the cooling ducts. Nothing fancy, nothing you'd write a manual about, but what it did was this. It let one man working fast hit every critical fastener in sequence without stopping to swap tools. Zeus fasteners that held the cowl sections, half a turn with the modified end, pop, next one. Fuel primer lock nut, same wrench, different angle. Magneto switch guards, flip them with the same tool, no fumbling for a screwdriver. Eddie drilled himself on it, alone, under a hooded work light so he wouldn't draw attention. He timed himself. He refined the sequence. He marked the wrench with paint so he knew which end for which task in the dark. And then he brought it to the line. The first time he tried it on a real scramble, the other crew chiefs thought he'd lost his mind. You don't improvise on the flight line. You follow the book because the book keeps people alive. But Eddie wasn't improvising the engineering. The aircraft systems were exactly the same. He was improvising the choreography. He'd worked out a flow, a rhythm, where every motion fed into the next without wasted steps. Pilot runs up as the klaxon sounds. Eddie's already at the aircraft, wrench in hand. Battery switch on. Eddie's got the cowl panels cracked by the time the pilot's strapping in. Fuel mixture set. Eddie's marked the throttle quadrant with a scratch of white paint so the pilot knows exactly where to stop. Primer. Eddie's got it pumped and locked while the pilot's still adjusting his goggles. Mags both. Booster coil energized, and here's where the trick really shows. Eddie's got the external starter cart coupled, but he's already loosened the disconnect, so the second the Merlin catches and settles, he yanks the plug, slings the cable, and slams the cowl panels home. No waiting, no second guessing. The Merlin is running rough, it always does when it's cold, but it's running, and that's what matters. Propeller pitch set. Eddie signals to the pilot. Thumbs up, you're good. And he's already pulling the wheel chocks as the oil pressure needle climbs. The pilot gooses the throttle, the Mustang lurches forward, and Eddie steps back, wrench still in his hand. Watch on his wrist showing 4 minutes 30 seconds from klaxon to taxi. 4.5 minutes. The other chiefs are staring. The operations officer, watching from the dispersal hut, is staring, because that's not supposed to be possible. They run it again the next scramble, this time with 2 aircraft, 2 crews using Eddie's method. 4 minutes 40, 4 minutes 50. Consistent, repeatable. The pilots notice it too because they're climbing out and they're hearing the radio chatter earlier, the GCI controller vectoring them onto targets that are still 50 miles out instead of 20. They're getting altitude, getting position, and when they do make contact, the geometry is theirs. The Messerschmitts are below them or at best co-altitude, reacting instead of dictating. That's the difference, that's what the wrench bought them. Word spreads fast in a fighter wing. By the end of the week, every crew chief in the squadron is watching Eddie work, asking questions, borrowing the wrench to study the angles. Some of them make their own versions, tweaking the design for their own hands, their own reflexes. The maintenance officer gets wind of it and nearly shuts it down. Non-standard tools, safety concerns, liability if something breaks, but the squadron CO steps in. He's flown enough missions to know what 10 extra minutes of warning time means. He tells maintenance to test it, document it, and if it's safe, adopt it. They do. They run a full check, torque specs on every fastener, inspection for stress cracks, verification that nothing is being skipped or compromised. It passes. The aircraft are no less airworthy, the procedures no less rigorous. It's just faster, safer even because the crew isn't rushing through multiple tool swaps and the pilot isn't sitting in a cold cockpit wondering if they're going to catch fire on start. The CO signs off, the wrench becomes standard. Now the scrambles change character. The klaxon goes off and the whole squadron knows they're going to make the intercept. The tension shifts from, will we get there in time, to where will we meet them? That's a psychological edge and it ripples through the entire operation. Pilots are calmer on the radio. Ground control is more aggressive with the vectors. The Luftwaffe, for their part, has no idea why the 357th Fighter Group out of Debden is suddenly appearing in their flight path 5 minutes earlier than the previous month. They don't have the intelligence reports to explain it. They just know that the Mustangs are higher, faster to the merge, and more often in position to bounce them from above. The intercept rates go up, the loss rates for bombers under escort go down, and somewhere in the middle of all this statistical improvement is a crew chief with a modified wrench, standing in the revetment, listening to the Merlins roar overhead, knowing that his hands put them there. Let's talk about what that wrench actually does, mechanically, because the details matter. The P-51s Packard Merlin V1650 is a beautiful engine. 12 cylinders, liquid-cooled, supercharged, capable of over 1,500 horsepower in war emergency power. But it is not a simple engine. It has systems layered on systems. Fuel injection, coolant circuits, oil scavenge, magnetos, generator, hydraulics for the prop, all of it interconnected. Starting it cold is a ballet of priming, timing, and faith. You pump the primer to inject raw fuel directly into the cylinders, bypassing the carburetor, giving the engine something to ignite on the first few compression strokes. You set the fuel mixture rich, so it doesn't lean out and backfire. You make sure the propeller is in fine pitch, full forward, minimum drag on the start. You check both magnetos are hot, because if one is dead, you'll get weak spark and a rough start, or no start at all. You engage the booster coil for extra spark energy, because cold plugs are lazy plugs. Then you hit the starter, electric motor turning the prop, compression building, and if you've done everything right, the Merlin coughs, bangs, belches a cloud of white smoke, and then settles into that unmistakable growl. If you've done something wrong, it backfires, floods, or just sits there clicking impotently while you smell avgas and panic. The standard checklist breaks this into discrete steps, each one verified, each one requiring a tool change or a position change or both. Eddie's wrench didn't skip steps. It eliminated the transitions. The tool stayed in his hand, the motion stayed continuous, and the result was that the engine got everything it needed in the right order without the crew stopping to think or reposition. The cowl fasteners are the other key piece. P-51s, like most operational fighters, use quick-release fasteners, Zeus fasteners, quarter-turn or half-turn cam locks that secure the aluminum cowl panels over the engine. They're designed for quick access during maintenance, but quick is relative. If you're cold, if you're wearing gloves, if the fastener is corroded or over-torqued, it can take 2 hands and a lot of swearing to get it open. Eddie's wrench, with its ground-down profile and the right angle of approach, could pop a Zeus in one smooth motion. No second try, no repositioning. Multiply that by 8 or 10 fasteners per cowl section, and you've saved a minute, maybe more. Then there's the question of panels on versus panels off. Some crews left the cowls off between sorties, figuring it saved time, but that meant exposed engines, more moisture in the cold, more chance of FOD, foreign object damage, from dirt or tools or some hapless bird deciding to nest in the intake. Eddie's method let you keep the panels on for protection and still get them off and back on faster than an open engine turnaround. Best of both worlds. The maintenance officer didn't like it at first, thought it was cowboy improvisation, until Eddie demonstrated it in front of the whole ground crew. Panels off and back on in under 90 seconds, no fasteners dropped, no scratches on the paint. After that, it was hard to argue. Then comes the morning that proves it all. February 1944, probably mid-month, weather cold and low overcast, visibility marginal. The kind of day where you think the Luftwaffe won't bother, because the bombers are grounded and there's no mission to escort. Wrong. Radar picks up a formation inbound from the east, low and fast, probably Jabos, Jagdbomber, fighter bombers, BF-109s or FW-190s carrying bombs, coming in under the weather to hit airfields or rail yards. The klaxon screams. Scramble. 8 aircraft. Immediate. Eddie's already running before the duty officer finishes the call. His Mustang, tail number he could draw in his sleep, sits in the revetment with frost on the wings. He doesn't think. He moves. Battery on. Fuel mix. Wrench in hand. Cowl panels popping like fireworks. Pilots sprinting across the dispersal. May West flapping. Helmet under his arm. Eddie yells the aircraft number. The pilot nods. Doesn't break stride. By the time the pilot's in the cockpit, Eddie's got the primer pumped and the mags live. The pilot flips the booster. Eddie couples the starter, and the Merlin catches on the second blade. Rough, coughing, spitting blue flame from the exhausts, but it catches. Oil pressure climbs. Eddie disconnects, slams the panels, pulls the chocks, slaps the fuselage twice. Go, go, go. 3 minutes 40 seconds. The pilot doesn't wait for full warm-up, just enough to keep the engine from seizing, and then he's taxiing fast, dirt and gravel kicking up behind the tail. The rest of the flight follows. 7 more Mustangs, 7 more crews doing the same frantic choreography, and within 6 minutes, the whole section is rolling, forming up on the taxi strip, throttles advancing. They take off in pairs, engines screaming, propellers biting air, lifting into the low grey overcast and disappearing. The controller vectors them east-northeast. Angels 12, target 20 miles, and closing. The Mustangs are climbing through the soup, instruments only, and the pilots are on oxygen watching their altitude tapes unwind. 12,000, 15,000. They break out on top at 18,000 into clear, cold sunlight, and there below them, the cloud deck is solid white, a floor that hides everything. Radar call. Bogies at 10 o'clock, 8 miles, Angels 8, crossing left to right. The lead pilot, call sign Cobweb Lead, racks the flight into a descending turn, throttles full, manifold pressure past the red line. They punch back down through the clouds and come out underneath at 9,000 feet with speed and altitude advantage. And there they are, Messerschmitts Bf-109G models, 6 of them in loose line abreast, flying nap of the earth with 250-kilogram bombs under the wings. They're headed for Debden or one of the nearby fields, probably don't even know the Mustangs are airborne yet, because the timeline says they shouldn't be, but they are. Cobweb Lead calls tally-ho and rolls in. The 109s see them. You can almost hear the German leads curse over the radio and jettison the bombs, braking hard left, trying to reverse and climb. Too late. The Mustangs are already firing, 650 caliber streams converging, and the first 109 trails smoke and rolls inverted, pilot punching out. The others scatter. One tries to dive for the deck, another breaks back into the cloud, a third tries to climb and gets sawed apart by Cobweb 3. It's over in 90 seconds. 4 Messerschmitts down, 1 probable, 1 got away. 0 losses for the Mustangs. They reform, check fuel, get a vector home. As they're climbing back up, Cobweb Lead keys the mic. Ground Cobweb Lead, tell the chief we made the party on time. Drinks are on him. The tower acknowledges, not understanding, but Eddie, listening on the crew frequency back at dispersal, knows exactly what it means. The wrench worked. They got there. They won. The after-action report that goes into the squadron log doesn't mention the wrench. It mentions the intercept, the kills, the tactical success, the coordination with GCI. But the pilots know. The crew chiefs know. And within a month, every P-51 squadron in the 8th Air Force has heard the story. Third hand, fourth hand, embellished and simplified, and probably half wrong by the time it crosses the Atlantic to the training bases in the States. But the core of it, the idea that you can cut your scramble time by rethinking the tools and the flow, that spreads. Some units adopt it wholesale, others try variations. A few reject it out of hand, too invested in the old ways or too risk-averse to change, that's fine. The ones who use it see results, faster response, better intercept geometry, fewer aborted scrambles, more confidence all around. The Luftwaffe notices eventually that the Americans are reacting faster, though they don't know why. They adjust tactics, come in higher, come in from different angles, try to avoid the intercept window altogether. But the math is hard. If you're trying to hit a target in southern England and the P-51s are scrambling 4 times faster than you planned for, your operational options shrink. You take more losses. Your strike success rate drops. The Allied air superiority, already tilting in 1944, tilts further. There's a moment late in the war, spring of 1945, when the Luftwaffe is basically out of fuel and experienced pilots, and the scrambles become rare, almost quaint. The last few Me-262 jets make desultory sorties, fast and hard to catch, but too few to matter. Eddie's still on the line, still carrying the wrench, but there's nothing to scramble against. The war in Europe ends, the squadron goes home, and the wrench, the actual physical wrench, probably ends up in a toolbox somewhere. Unremarkable, forgotten. No one writes it up for a commendation. No one patents the design. It's just a thing that worked, and then it wasn't needed anymore. But the pilots who flew those scrambles, the ones who lived because they got to altitude in time, because they made the intercept instead of missing it, they remember. Some of them, years later, at reunions, mention the crew chief who figured out how to shave 15 minutes off a scramble with a modified wrench and some clever thinking. And the story gets told again, passed down, refined, maybe not entirely accurate, but accurate enough. Because that's how wars are won, not just with grand strategy and industrial output and bravery, though all of those matter, but with small, unglamorous innovations like a ground-down wrench that let one mechanic do his job better. The Messerschmitts were fast, deadly, and flown by some of the best pilots in the world, but they couldn't outrun a guy who figured out how to start an engine 4 times quicker. What made the wrench hack effective wasn't just the tool, it was the mindset behind it. Eddie and the crew chiefs like him understood that war doesn't wait for you to be perfect. It doesn't care about your procedures or your regulations or your comfort level. It cares about results. The Merlin engine didn't care if you used a standard wrench or a modified one. As long as the fasteners were torqued, the primer was pumped, and the magnetos were hot. The P-51 didn't care if you followed the manual step by step or reordered the sequence, as long as it was airworthy and ready to fly. The Luftwaffe didn't care about your scramble time, except insofar as it determined whether you intercepted them or not. Eddie cared about results. He saw a problem, too slow, and he solved it with what he had, a wrench, a grinder, and an understanding of the systems he worked on every day. That's field expedience. That's the difference between a technician and a craftsman. A technician follows instructions. A craftsman understands why the instructions exist and knows when to bend them. The P-51 Mustang, for all its legendary status, was not a forgiving aircraft to maintain. The Packard Merlin was temperamental in cold weather. The coolant system was prone to leaks. The landing gear retraction mechanism could jam. The gun bays collected spent brass and links that had to be cleared after every mission. The plexiglass canopy scratched if you looked at it wrong. And all of this had to be kept operational in conditions that ranged from freezing mud in England to dusty heat in Italy to the chaos of forward airstrips in France after D-Day. The crew chiefs didn't have climate-controlled hangars or unlimited spare parts or 8-hour shifts. They had revetments, tarps, work lights that ran off generators, and whatever they could scrounge or fabricate. If you needed a tool, you made it. If you needed a part, you borrowed it from a salvage bird. If you needed time, you found a way to save it. That was the culture. That was the expectation. Eddie's wrench wasn't an anomaly. It was an example of what happened every day on every flight line in the war. The difference was that his solution happened to save enough time, in a critical enough scenario that it changed outcomes. How many other small innovations like that happened and were never recorded? How many other crew chiefs made their own tools, their own jigs, their own workarounds that kept aircraft flying and pilots alive? Thousands, probably. Tens of thousands. The historical record captures the big stuff. The battles, the strategies, the named aces, the Medal of Honor recipients. It doesn't capture the crew chief who stayed up all night repairing a hydraulic line so his pilot could fly the next morning. It doesn't capture the armorer who rigged a faster belt feed so the guns wouldn't jam. It doesn't capture the wrench, and yet the wrench, or things like it, are why the Allies won. Not the only reason, not even the main reason, but part of the aggregate of 10,000 small advantages that added up to overwhelming superiority. The Luftwaffe had excellent aircraft, excellent pilots, and a defensive doctrine that should have made it nearly impossible to achieve air superiority over Europe. What they didn't have was the depth, the industrial capacity, the training pipeline, the logistical tail, the improvisational culture that let the Allies sustain operations and adapt faster than the enemy could respond. When an American crew chief modified a wrench to save time, he wasn't just helping his squadron, he was participating in a system-wide culture of problem-solving that the Germans, for all their engineering prowess, couldn't match. The Luftwaffe had rigid procedures, rigid thinking, rigid logistics. When they lost an engine or a tool or a trained mechanic, it was hard to replace. When the Allies lost something, they adapted, they improvised, they found another way. That's the real lesson of the wrench hack. It's not about the wrench, it's about the willingness to look at a problem and say, this could be better, and then do something about it. So here's the final question. If you were Eddie standing in that revetment at Debden in February 1944, wrench in hand, watching your pilot taxi out 3.5 minutes after the klaxon, knowing that you just changed the Intercept timeline and maybe saved lives, how would that feel? Would it feel like heroism? Probably not. Probably it would just feel like doing your job the way you knew it should be done, the way that made sense when you thought it through. No fanfare, no ceremony, just the satisfaction of seeing the system work the way it was supposed to, efficiently, effectively, without waste. That's the quiet pride of the mechanic. The crew chief, the technician, the people who don't fly the missions, but make the missions possible. The pilots get the glory and they deserve it, but the crew chiefs get the knowledge that without them, none of it happens. The Mustangs don't scramble. The Intercepts don't occur. The Messerschmitts get through. The war goes differently. One wrench, one innovation, one crew chief who cared enough to try something new. That's how you intercept Messerschmitts 4 times quicker. That's how you win a war, one small victory at a time. If this story hit you the way it hit me, if you're realizing that the real heroes aren't always the ones in the cockpits, that the difference between victory and defeat can be measured in minutes and modified tools, then make sure you're subscribed. Because there are 1,000 more stories like this, buried in the flight logs and the maintenance reports and the oral histories of the crew chiefs who kept the Allied Air Forces flying. Every video on this channel digs into those forgotten corners, into the engineering and the improvisation and the human ingenuity that changed history. Hit that subscribe button. And drop a comment. What's the most underrated innovation in military history that you know about? Let's keep this conversation going, because the war wasn't just won in the air or on the ground. It was won in the revetments, in the hangars, with wrenches and wits and the refusal to accept good enough when better was possible. Eddie and the thousands of crew chiefs like him proved that, and we owe them more than a footnote. We owe them the full story.